Okay, so you're here because you really want to understand how we can tackle climate change, right?
Yeah.
Like you want to get past the headlines and the political noise and actually dig into the details.
Yeah, that's what we do best here, right? We take a deep dive into these complex issues. And today's topic, well, it's one that's surrounded by a lot of strong opinions and even stronger emotions. We're talking about nuclear power.
Right. And is it a potential solution for climate change?
Yeah.
A dangerous distraction?
Yeah.
Or something in between? I mean, that's what we're going to try and figure out today, right? And to help us navigate this minefield, we're going to be looking very closely at a specific research paper.
Yes, exactly. The paper is called Evaluating Nuclear Power's Suitability for Climate Change Mitigation, Technical Risks, Economic Implications, and Incompatibility with Renewable Energy Systems. Quite a mouthful.
It is quite a mouthful.
Hmm.
But it really lays out the case against nuclear power as a climate solution. And it does so by examining those three key aspects: the technical risks, the economic implications, and how nuclear power might actually clash with the renewable energy systems we need.
Yes. And it's published in Frontiers in Environmental Economics, so this is not just some random blog post. This is a serious academic analysis by Prager and colleagues.
Okay, so before we even get into the specific arguments of this paper, let's just acknowledge the elephant in the room, right? Nuclear power, well, it has a history, it has a baggage.
Yeah, history might be putting it lightly. I mean, when you think about it, the first use of nuclear technology was for weapons. The atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. That casts a very long shadow, right?
It absolutely does. And then, of course, you have these major accidents that come to mind almost immediately: Chernobyl, Fukushima. These disasters that really solidified the image of nuclear power as inherently dangerous in the public mind.
Right. And the paper digs into this. It starts by stating that even with the most advanced safety measures, major nuclear accidents are essentially unavoidable. And that's because of the immense energy involved in nuclear fission and the persistent radioactivity of the waste.
Okay, so you're saying that even if we do everything right, even if we build the safest reactors imaginable, there's still a chance, a real chance, that something could go terribly wrong.
Unfortunately, yes. The paper emphasizes the sheer difficulty of containing these materials and controlling these reactions, not just for years or decades, but for centuries or even millennia. The waste from nuclear power remains radioactive for a very, very long time. It requires constant vigilance and management.
So it's not a case of build it and forget it. This is a technology that demands our attention and our careful management indefinitely. And the paper points to some historical accidents that really drive this point home.
Oh. Yeah, it goes beyond Chernobyl and Fukushima. It mentions earlier accidents like the partial meltdown at Chalk River in Canada in 1952, the fire at Windscale in the UK in 1957, and an explosion at the Mayak nuclear complex in the Soviet Union also in 57. These events really underscore that the risks are not hypothetical, they're real.
And it's not just the big catastrophic events, right? There are smaller incidents that happen more frequently that can still have significant consequences.
Exactly. And the paper even talks about how we measure the severity of these accidents. You know, you've probably heard of the INES scale, the International Nuclear Event Scale.
I have, yeah. It goes from like minor incidents to major accidents.
Right. But the paper argues that the INES scale might not fully capture the true magnitude of the worst events. For example, some analyses suggest that if the scale went higher, the Fukushima disaster might have been classified as something like a 10.6.
Wow. Significantly higher than the official level 7 designation.
Right. It highlights that even our ways of measuring these events are potentially underestimating the true impact. And it mentions an alternative scale, the nuclear accident magnitude scale, which focuses more on the actual amount of radiation released.
So, okay, we've talked about the inherent risks of nuclear power.
Yeah.
Let's shift gears now and talk about the economics. Because a lot of the pro-nuclear arguments rest on the idea that it's a cost-effective solution, right?
Right. But this paper, it really challenges that assumption. It argues that nuclear power has never actually been economically sustainable on its own in a truly competitive market.
And why is that?
Well, it goes back to its origins. Nuclear power was initially developed, as we talked about, for weapons where cost wasn't the primary concern, and that legacy continues to haunt it in a way. The research cited in this paper suggests that nuclear power has struggled to compete with fossil fuels like coal and natural gas for decades, and that's not even factoring in the full cost of the risks we just talked about.
And what about these modern reactors that are being built, the so-called Generation 3 reactors? Are they more cost effective?
Well, The paper analyzes the financial outlook for these newer reactors, and the picture isn't pretty. For a typical 1,600 megawatt plant, potential losses over its lifetime could be in the range of $5 to $10 billion.
Wow, that's a huge amount of money.
Yeah, and the paper points to some real-world examples. The Vodal project in the U.S., Olkiluoto in Finland, Flamanville in France, Hinkley Point C in the U.K. All of these projects have faced massive cost overruns and delays, and they're only surviving because of huge government subsidies and guaranteed prices for the electricity they produce.
So it's not just a theoretical problem, it's playing out in real time all over the world.
Exactly. And the paper identifies some key reasons for this. The high upfront costs for construction, the long construction times, and the uncertain revenues once the plant is operational. And, we haven't even factored in the cost of decommissioning the plant at the end of its life and managing the waste for essentially forever.
So the economics of nuclear power are shaky at best. And this paper uses a metric called the levelized cost of electricity, or LCOE, to compare the cost of nuclear power with other sources.
Right. The LCOE takes into account all the costs associated with generating electricity over a plant's lifetime. And for nuclear power, the paper estimates an expected LCOE of around $160 per megawatt hour. But there's a huge range of uncertainty. It could be as low as $91 or as high as $222.
And how does that compare to renewables, like solar and wind?
That's the thing. The LCOE for unsubsidized wind and solar is now in the range of $50 to $60 per megawatt hour. So it's significantly lower than even the most optimistic projections for nuclear.
Okay, so the economics are a major strike against nuclear. But this paper goes even further. It argues that nuclear power is actually incompatible with the renewable energy systems that we need to build to address climate change.
Yeah, that's right. And this might be the most important takeaway for listeners. Nuclear power plants are designed to operate as baseload generators, meaning they run at a constant output 24/7. But renewable sources like solar and wind, well, they're variable. Their output fluctuates depending on the weather. And this is where the clash happens.
So a grid with lots of solar and wind needs to be flexible, right? It needs to be able to adjust quickly to changes in supply and demand.
Exactly. And nuclear plants, well, they're not very flexible. They're not designed to ramp up or down their output quickly. They're like a giant ship. It takes a long time to turn them around.
And so what happens when you try to combine these two very different types of energy sources?
Well, it creates problems. If you have a lot of nuclear power on the grid, it can actually make it harder to integrate large amounts of renewables. You might end up having to curtail the output from the renewables, which defeats the purpose.
So the argument here is that nuclear power, instead of helping us transition to a clean energy future, could actually hold us back.
Yeah, that's a central point of the paper. It's not just that nuclear has its own risks and economic challenges. It's that it can actually make it harder to build the kind of flexible and resilient energy system we need to rely on renewables.
And then there are the longer-term vulnerabilities of nuclear power that the paper discusses, like the impacts of climate change itself and the potential for proliferation.
Right. Nuclear power plants are very sensitive to changes in water availability and temperature, which are both being affected by climate change. We've already seen reactors having to reduce output or even shut down during heat waves and droughts. And then you have the risks posed by rising sea levels and extreme weather events, especially for coastal reactors.
And the proliferation issue is a huge concern as well, right? I mean, the fact that the materials and technology used in nuclear power plants can also be used to develop weapons makes it a target for terrorists and rogue states.
Absolutely. And the paper highlights that the lack of a permanent disposal solution for nuclear waste just adds to this vulnerability. We're essentially creating a legacy of hazardous materials that will need to be managed for thousands of years.
So it's not just about the risks of accidents at the plants themselves. It's about the broader security risks associated with this technology.
And those risks are only likely to increase in a world that is becoming increasingly unstable and unpredictable.
So as we wrap up here, I think it's clear that this paper presents a very strong case against nuclear power as a climate solution.
Yes, it's a very comprehensive analysis that looks at the technical, economic, and systemic challenges. And the conclusion is that nuclear power is more likely to be an obstacle than an asset in our efforts to decarbonize.
And it's important to remember that this paper was published in a peer-reviewed academic journal. It's not just someone's opinion. It's based on a careful review of the evidence.
Exactly. And it's a valuable contribution to this very important debate. It forces us to think critically about the role of nuclear power and to consider the full range of costs and risks involved.
So as our listeners are digesting all of this information, here's a final question for you to ponder. If nuclear power is not the answer, then what is? What are the most promising pathways to achieving a rapid and sustainable transition to a clean energy future? There's a lot to think about and a lot of work to be done. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
Absolutely. Until next time.